Hey there, movie fans. Scott Mantz here with a brand new episode of Consider This. Now, if you've been watching so far, you know that I love the movies of 1999. Well, this episode of Consider This is focused on a big one because it is the film from 1999 that won the Academy Award for Best Picture. That, of course, is American Beauty, a film that I think really holds up and means a lot of different things today than it did back in 1999. Also winning an Academy Award is director Sam Mendes, and that is the focus of my conversation about the making of American Beauty. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Scott Mantz. Follow me on social media at Movie Mantz. Look closer and enjoy the conversation. And joining us, I am so excited and grateful. Sam Mendes, he is the Oscar-winning Best Director of American Beauty. Sam, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Oh, it's a great pleasure, Scott. Lovely to see you.
Sam, I got to say, we just talked about this for a moment off camera, but 1999 was just an incredible year, hence the screening series, the year that changed cinema. What's your take on American Beauty's place in that year and how the film has held up and maybe come to mean something different over these years?
Well, I mean, the first thing is it was my first movie, and so it was my first year being involved in movies. So I just assumed that every movie year was like that, that every movie year had like 30 great movies in it. And but the thing about American Beauty within that year is I remember the LA Times full preview edition coming out, and I was so excited because I thought, here's my, finally. It kind of didn't feel real until it was being reported on, and it was really the first moment we were going to have, an acknowledgement of that. And I bought it, and I flicked through it, and it wasn't in there at all, because it wasn't considered a big enough movie to be in that full preview edition. And so I think the thing to remember about American Beauty is that it really wasn't on the radar of anyone, including myself, if you know what I mean. I didn't think I was making a movie that would enter the culture in the way that it did. For us, we were making a movie for a new studio. It was DreamWorks. They'd had a great year the previous year with Saving Private Ryan, and they were going to go on to make Gladiator, but they were making Gladiator while we were shooting, and we were the tiny movie that was under the radar. Nobody really looked at us within the studio. They were very supportive, but they weren't there every day. They were worrying that they were going over budget on Gladiator. And they just let us get on with it. And we were shooting it around the corner from the studio. And I remember when we were a couple of weeks into shooting, and Conrad Hall, who I still miss whenever I make a movie, a great cinematographer who shot American Beauty and won the Academy Award for it, got nominated for an Oscar for his work on, I think it was Civil Action, which was the movie with John Travolta that Steve Zalian had made the previous year.
Right.
And I just thought, wow, wouldn't it be incredible if we got nominated for an Academy Award for the cinematography for this movie? But the idea that we would not only get nominated for however many we got nominated, I can't remember now, and win was just not even, it wasn't on the radar at all. So everything that happened thereafter was a kind of was a kind of slow moving dream, you know what I mean? And I watched all these movies come in, and because we were kind of anointed at the beginning of that in September, we opened in September, and we were just rolling on in those days. We stayed in cinemas for a year. There was a cinema on Wiltshire, the cinema on Wiltshire, that played us for over a year. It just seems like, I don't know, it seems like a century ago, not just 20 years.
Okay, so Sam, first of all, the theater on Wilshire, that was the Fine Arts Theater, which is
Yeah.
on Wilshire right by La Cienega. The movie opened on September 15th, 1999. And, to just, hold that momentum and build the momentum actually to go on to win 5 Academy Awards, Best Picture, Director, Original Screenplay, Best Actor for Kevin Spacey, and like you said, cinematography for Conrad Hall, his second Oscar. And it went on to gross for a movie that only cost $15 million and does not look like it. It cost looks like it cost way more than that, but it went on to gross $356 million worldwide. Nuts. But this was your first feature. So, at the time you were getting so much acclaim for Cabaret and Blue Room. So how did you come to talk with Steven Spielberg, and what did he see in the film and in you to make him go, this is our director?
Well, I mean, even now I think it's bizarre, frankly, that I ended up with that screenplay on my lap. But the truth was that I'd opened Cabaret on Broadway. He'd come to see it. They were starting a new studio. They had all sorts of scripts knocking around, and they had this original screenplay, and they had offered it to some pretty major filmmakers. Mike Nichols, I know, turned it down. Robert Zemeckis, Curtis Hanson, and they're all pretty senior filmmakers. And I think they'd all said, "Look, we'd like a bit more money to make the movie than you're offering us." And DreamWorks had said, "No, no, no, we want to make this, smaller on a smaller independent scale." And after Cabaret opened, my agent, who's still my agent, Beth Swafford, said, "Hey, listen, the people want you to come out to LA. There's people want to offer you stuff. Now is the time to come out. You've got a hit on Broadway." And so I came out, and on her stairs in her house where she lived, I can't remember, was it it's somewhere in Laurel Canyon. There was 8 scripts sitting on the stairs, and she said, "These are all for you." And this is the old days when you used to get them in the red binders with CAA written on the front.
Oh yeah.
And she handed me to them to me, and the first one was American Beauty, and I went back on the plane 2 days later, and I had them in my bag, and I opened this first script, and I started reading it, and I thought, either I've sort of graduated to this dream world where every screenplay I read is going to be extraordinary, or this is an amazing one-off screenplay. And I didn't pick up any of the others. I just started that one again. I just couldn't believe how good it was.
Mm.
It felt like reading a great play in the sense that it felt complete. It felt very visually articulate, very cinematic. It felt very funny. I always felt I was making a comedy, um, and lest we forget, when the Golden Globes, it won Best Comedy, not Best Drama.
Right.
Um, so the fact that it sort of entered the zeitgeist and became some statement about contemporary America was not. That was how the culture received it. That wasn't how it was made. It was made with a spirit of invention and a kind of strange freedom, and and that's how it felt on set. And it was also first time producers. Even though Dan, James, Bruce Cohen had been around for a while, and Bruce was an AD for many years, it was their first movie as producers. It was Alan Ball's first produced screenplay.
Wow.
He'd been writing sitcoms. It was my first movie. So all of us as a little gang, we were making something that we just felt very passionately about. Um, and I remember when the day it was released, Terry Press saying, you know, I remember Fargo was a movie that had come out recently, and it's a great movie. It remains an absolute classic Coen Brothers movie. And I said, "How do you think this is going to do?" And Terry, who was, our sort of marketing maestro, said, "I think it'll do a kind of Fargo business." And I said, "How much is that?" I had no idea. She said, "Around $35 million." And I thought, "Wow, that's great. That's double what it cost."
Yeah.
And you just told me, which I'd forgotten. It took $350 million, and so it was just beyond anything that we had imagined. So, but it was a great experience. It was one of the just creatively, I felt like after a week I had more freedom than I did for another 20 years making a movie. It wasn't until I did 1917 that I felt I had the same freedom and the same kind of instinctual grasp of what I was doing that I had when I hadn't done anything. And that's one of the strange ironies of movie making.
So I'm just really curious, when you read that first script, when you read Alan's like first take on it that you got, how was the version that you saw at that time different from the version you wound up filming? Or were there any differences?
We filmed, I mean, I was absolutely rigid about observing what Alan had written. And I felt very strongly that so many turns of phrase, so many beautiful moments, so many effortlessly funny pieces of writing. I really felt it was on the page. We
Wow.
did a little bit of improvisation. I rehearsed for 2 weeks. That was how I knew I wanted to construct this family, and I wanted them to know each other, and I wanted everyone to understand what I was looking for. I come from the theater. Rehearsals for me is like, it feels very much like how I like to start working on anything. And so we improvised a bit around the table, and particularly Annette Bening, was brilliant and did a little bit of improvisation. We scripted that, anything that was good, we sort of made it, we put it into the script. But other than that, we left it. The interesting thing about the movie was that it was in the editing process that we rewrote it. And the old adage that the movie is written 4 times, uh, is true. And editing is the last writing process, and that was when it really changed, because there was a bookend, there was a framing device that we removed entirely. And much to Alan's dismay, when he saw the movie, he said, you've taken out some of the framing device. And I said, I hate to say this, but I think we need to take it all out. And he was quite upset. And the next day said, I'll do it quickly and then you can come and watch it. And he came the next day, and to his credit, he said, no, you're absolutely right. It's much better. And that was the big change, but it happened right at the end.
All right, so I'm really curious. So when it came to casting Lester Burnham, I rewatched the movie just the other day. I saw it many, many times back in the day and just periodically over the years, but it had been a while, certainly since before like the pandemic, and I hadn't seen it in a while. And I was struck by how much the movie means something a little different now, because the world has changed so much, especially in the United States, but also like how perfect, perfect Kevin Spacey is as Lester Burnham. Um, was he always sort of like who you wanted, or was it just like a happy accident that you landed with Kevin?
I was very particular. I mean, I had seen Kevin was around a lot in London at that time. He was in a production of The Iceman Cometh. Um, he had been in Usual Suspects and Glengarry, 2 movies that I'd loved.
Oh yeah.
And for whatever reason, I saw him in the role. I felt like he was the person that popped into my head along with Annette. Actually, Annette came about because I was in a hotel room and I remember the pay-per-view watching Mars Attacks. You remember the Tim Burton movie? And she was just she just made me laugh. And I thought that kind of slightly manic energy she brought to that, I thought would be perfect. And I was casting, for me, I was casting a couple. I wasn't just casting one character. I wanted to cast them as a married couple.
Mm.
And I felt like I needed to do that at the same time. A little bit like casting, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf or something. It was about the chemistry between them. And I found that slightly, the prospect of those two quite kinetic, odd, electric energies together
Well,
was
yeah,
what attracted me.
I gotta say, Sam, the thing about their casting is, when they're bickering, like the rhythm just works perfectly, but there's that one moment on the couch, after he's like got his confidence back and he's like, trying to seduce her until she says, "Don't spill the beer on the couch,"
Yeah.
But for that one moment, like I really bought into like the romantic chemistry between them. Like if it had happened, I totally would have been into it. But Annette is fantastic in the film.
Yeah.
The scene when she tries to sell the house and then has that breakdown where she's like smacking herself, like, shut up, shut up. What was it like filming that particular scene with her? Because that is a maestro actress at the top of her game.
Well, I tell you a story about that scene. We shot it and it was too dark. Uh, so I'd done 2 or 3 takes. She was brilliant. And if you remember, she comes in through the French doors and she closes the blinds and it gets dark in there. And then she starts hitting herself and then she walks off camera. And I wanted the camera static. Um, and Conrad Hall had basically he made a mistake. It's the only mistake he made on the picture. He came in the next day, shamefaced, and he said, "Listen, it's too dark. I can't dig it out. We're gonna have to reshoot it." And I was mortified because it was a big scene for her, and I didn't mention it to her. And the AD put it on the schedule, and she saw it on the schedule, and she called me and she said, "Are we shooting that scene again?" And I said, Oh, yeah, I forgot to tell you, Connie underlit it and she's like, you have to tell me that. She was pissed with me. And I said, you're absolutely right. I'm so sorry. I was so, intent on the next day. And I had mentioned it to her. So sure enough, the next week we came to do it. And she walked in and she absolutely nailed it on the first take. And it was better. And this has happened a few times to me. It was better the second time. I couldn't tell you why exactly. I just felt that some of the rage she felt in having to do it again had got put into the scene. You know what I mean? She was
Yeah.
sort of pissed about the whole thing. And so it kind of erupted. And she walked off camera and I said, cut, that's it. Fantastic, you got it. And she walked right over and she said, are you sure? Like that. And I was like, like that.
Oh boy.
She didn't suffer fools. She's, but it was so clearly electric.
Yeah.
And it actually that happened to me the last movie I made as well with Olivia Colman. We made a little technical error. We did it again, and it was much better the second time. I mean, so that was a stroke of luck, and there were many strokes of luck throughout. The biggest stroke of luck, which I know is a sort of apocryphal story, is that I blew the first 2 days of principal photography completely. I got it 100% wrong. The costumes were wrong. I hadn't populated the background properly. It was overlit. It was the wrong location. There were any number of things that were wrong with it. But because it was so wrong, I could see that it was wrong. In other words, if it had been a little bit wrong, I might not have gone back. But I thought it was so clearly not what I wanted. It helped me understand what I did want.
Mhm.
And I went to the studio to Bob Cooper, who was running the studio at that time, head of production, and said, "Can I do those 2 days again, please?" And I think because I was so confident about what it was that I felt I needed, he said yes, and that was another stroke of luck. And there were lots of little things when Kevin is, when Lester Burnham's getting stoned outside the real estate convention with Ricky, he may or may not have been smoking a real joint, but the giggles that he gets in the middle of the scene is Kevin getting the giggles, and you see just for a brief moment his eyes flick over to where I was sitting next to the monitor screen, and I remember going like this, meaning keep going,
Oh,
because I kind of love you know, that's the freedom of it, and there was a looseness there which I think crept into the movie, and and it felt, despite its sort of visual formality, it felt very alive all the time. And I think that was a lot of theater experience. I think I was able to provide a framework within which they could be quite free and yet stay on text. And I think that was something that I learned from years and years of rehearsals.
so I got to tell you, so I remember vividly, like it was right around the time of the Oscar nominations for that year. So that would put us, I think, into 2000. Um, and I'm like, why the hell isn't the score available on CD? And then it finally came out. And the reason I bring this up, Sam, is because Thomas Newman is one of my favorite composers. I discovered him, if you will, with his score for The Player back in 1992.
Yeah, great score, great score.
Great score. But his score for American Beauty is just beautiful. It's just absolutely beautiful. I've listened to it many, many, many times to this day. How did you come to work with Thomas Newman? And what was it like the first time you heard his score?
Well, I mean, I've worked with Tom now, I uh, right the way through to 1917. He scored pretty much every movie I've made, so it's been a very close relationship, and I felt like he was doing me a favor when he did American Beauty, because he was working way under his rate. He was a
Yeah.
young filmmaker. The Player was a big influence on why I asked him to do it. The Player score for Robert Altman. He did a score of a movie called Unsung Heroes with Totoro, which I think Diane Keaton directed. He did a brilliant score, obviously, for Shawshank. So
Yes.
those three scores, all of which were very different. One was very percussive, one very vibey, which was the Player score, and then this very cool orchestral score for Shawshank. And I think that I kind of felt like all of them had some place in our movie, and so I the movie very closely with the things that he'd done, which is a tricky thing to do with a composer because you fall in love with the temp score a little bit. Um, and so he had to break out of that and create its own, give the score its own sound. And he worked very brilliantly with a small group of players, all people he knew. Many of them had played on those scores. And then he added the orchestral stuff afterwards. So it had a kind of funky, percussive freedom, something a little bit mischievous about it, a little bit kind of spiky. And I felt it was very original. I felt like, you know, it was the combination of lots of things. It was a European aesthetic in many ways that I felt I brought to it, but applied to, a, a area of the world that you would not normally associate with that aesthetic, which is American suburbia. And then there were all these other elements. And so when you put them all together, it added up to more than the sum of its parts. And I was aware of that it was Tom's, we added Tom's score, it suddenly sort of elevated the whole thing, lifted off the ground in the way that you hope with music, when music kind of suspended it in a way, and allowed me to cut the thing at times longer than would seem normal. And I felt the music talked back to the picture at those moments. So things like the plastic bag sequence, I felt I was able to cut it partly because of the music that I was using and that Tom had composed. I lengthened it. I spent less time with them, more time on the image of the bag, and that happened a few times. With some of Ricky's video footage of Jane and other moments in the movie where I felt it achieved a kind of, it takes a shift, it takes a turn about halfway from that scene onwards, and it shifts from a broader comic tone really to something much more poetic and strange,
Found.
and it is a weird picture in some ways. It remains. I remember winning the LA critics, one of the LA critics was, I can't remember, and Ken Turan made the speech, and he said, look, we now know that it's been a big success, but remember the feeling of watching this movie in the first time you saw it, and how strange and unusual the film is. And I think of it in that way. I thought he was right to say, just forget the noise and just remember the strange, odd spell it cast, and it is a very strange movie. And even now, and I showed it to my kids, now they're old enough, and they're like, wow, that's a weird movie, Dad. And it is quite a weird movie. It's funny and odd, um and when you talk about when in America it was made, also, it was made in the era of two things were prevalent. One is Clinton. It was a Clinton era movie. It is a movie made in an era of a president and a young girl. The Lewinsky thing was very current at that point, and so there was an obsession with that. I think with older men and younger women, and there was also a kind of post Columbine obsession after the high school shooting about were people doing next door that you didn't know about? What were the violent acts that were planned? What was going on in the garages next door to your house? And so there was a sort of oddness about the way that suburbia was perceived then. Retrospectively, post 9/11, it seemed to me, I remember thinking this, a sort of act of navel gazing. That it was a movie that looked inside, into America, as if there was nothing else in the world that was important, and then post 9/11, it seemed very unimportant for a time. And I think that's just the way it goes, isn't it? Movies reflect the wider culture, and they change their meaning over time. And this is certainly one that's evolved and shifted its meaning, with ensuing years.
Sam, I got to say, one of the other things that I sort of attribute the success and the longevity and the evolution and the interpretation of the film is also what happened in 1999 was, you had this new device to get information called the internet. At least it was new to the public. And
Yeah.
also, I remember towards the end of the year, everybody was freaking out because, oh my God, it's Y2K, like everything's going to fall apart. And that the tagline for the film, Look Closer, which is on the poster, and then it's also in Lester Burnham's cubicle, is like nothing is as it seems, which it still isn't. But in the end, the last question, Sam, is how proud are you that this movie has endured and evolved and and did so well, and your first movie, you won the Oscar for directing and Best Picture. How proud are you of this movie?
I remain really proud of it. I think there's a section in the middle of the movie around the time of the plastic bag scene where, and then the movie shifts and we go into a row across the dinner table, and then the Jane and Carolyn, which is Annette Bening's character, go upstairs, and then it evolves again into a strange scene between Ricky over the way, who's filming her, and she starts to take her clothes off. I think it's like one of the strangest and sequences, and one of the sequences I'm most proud of anything I've ever done, theater or film. Um, I think the thing about film is you have to try and remind yourself of the pleasure of creation and not the eventual, the effect of the movie is out of your control. I think that you have to remind yourself of the sheer joy of doing it. And for me, that was the thing I remember. I remember the just feeling I would rather be nowhere else than here on this set with these people. It felt special. And the fact that other people thought that when they saw it is just the gravy. But for me, it was a great experience. And I'm still, in a state of wonder that script was sitting on those stairs in LA, and that someone handed it to me.
Well, Sam, I cannot thank you enough for this amazing conversation. And also, just full disclosure, I am a huge, massive, diehard, lifelong, totally obsessed Beatle maniac. So I cannot wait for your next four movies.
Exactly.
But again, Sam, thank you so much for this conversation. And thank you,
Pleasure.
everyone, for watching American Beauty as part of Landmark Theater's screening series, Retro Replay screening series, 1999, the year that changed cinema. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Great pleasure.